Is there a mic?
Oh, we got a camera and everything.
I'm Luis Vivanco. I am the co-director of the Humanities Center here at UVM and a bike researcher, bicycle transportation researcher. And it struck me in doing the kind of research that I do on bicycles, which is qualitative, cultural oriented research, that there are others out there exploring bicycle transportation in other ways beyond the traditional sort of norms that transportation researchers do, who are in this community. And so about a month and a half ago, David Cavannaugh was giving a reading of his new book, Cycling in Platos Cave, and I attended, and the poetry was so powerful about bikes and about things that are way beyond bikes, that I thought, what a productive opportunity we could have to bring together those of us interested in bikes, to see bikes from different angles, to help us see the fullness of ways of thinking about bikes. And in my job as co-director of the Humanities Center, one of the things that we really are prioritizing are these sort of gatherings that maybe normally might not talk to each other. And so fortunately, Glenn McCrae here thinks like I do, and so it was really a matter of saying, hey, Glenn, what do you think if we got the Transportation Research Center together with the Humanities Center, bring David in and see what happens in thinking about bicycles. And so Dave Cavannaugh has been at Johnson State for a long time, working in the external degree program, has 3 books of poetry, and is a reliable cyclist. You will see him out on his bike a lot on pleasure rides, transportation. And if you haven't yet gotten a copy of Cycling in Platos Cave, it is available at Phoenix Books. And there are some wonderful, wonderful poems. And so we're going to get a taste of that and have some conversation with Dave and see some pictures, because the visual piece is a big part of this project. So Dave, thank you very much for coming, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Luis. Thanks, Luis, and thanks, Glenn, and the Humanities Center, the Transportation Research Center, which I didn't even know existed until recently, and I'm delighted to know about it. Thanks for having me here, inviting me here to share at least 2 of my obsessions, poetry and cycling, and to see how they might connect, and maybe how they might reach out in some ways that cross some of the usual boundaries. I think Luis was talking about that as well. We share that interest. This book grew out of another book, actually, that I'm preparing, and which would be out in the coming year. 2015. Well, I noticed that as I was working on the manuscript for that book, that there were 2 or 3 poems about cycling. And I've been an avid cyclist for many, many years. Started to think that maybe I could push that line a little bit and see where it went. And I also got encouragement, actually, from a colleague of yours, Antonella Bora, professor in the Romance Languages department, who is the devil, sabbatical in Italy for this year. But he encouraged me to see if it could become a book. And lo and behold, once I started along that line of thought, more poems started to come about cycling. Maybe they're about cycling. And sort of the way a bicycle, once you get on a bike, starting it is a little tricky. It wobbles and you get going, but once you're going, it's a pretty smooth way of moving along. And that's what happened with this book, actually. Once I got going on it, it was the easiest book I've ever done to do, and a joy from beginning to end, really. So the book itself, I think of it in a bunch of different ways. It's a meditation. a way of connecting at some issues and getting at some issues that are important to me. It's also a commentary, I think, in a very idiosyncratic commentary and in no way comprehensive about different aspects of cycling. From talk about the equipment to the wind in your face to your sore butt after you've been on the bike for a long time, those kinds of things. And ultimately about what I regard as the beauty of not only bicycles, but cycling as a whole. So let me announce my bias right from the outset. I'm an unabashed lover of all things cycling. So I'll read for a while from the book, maybe for half an hour or so, depending on what your level of interest seems to be, and then we can discuss. But also along the way, if thoughts occur to you, feel free to interrupt. This can be a discussion. Any cyclists here? I know these, of course. Oh my God, fabulous, almost perfect. Party favors. Here you go. These are, let's grab a few. I call these bicycle backsides. and they can go they can go on, they go easily with twist ties on the back of your saddle or on the back of your rack, or actually it occurred to me that if you're not a cyclist and you're a pedestrian, you could just put it on your backside. And that would be perfect. This one's got twisties, so somebody can have that one. I don't have ready to go. Anyway. There are also, as Luis mentioned, some photos in this book, and I'll share a few of those. Another one of the delights of this book, actually, is that the photographs are by, you'll notice similarity in names here, by my nephew, Ben Cavannaugh, who's a professional photographer in Ottawa, and my brother, Pat Cavannaugh, who is a psychologist, but an amateur photographer. This cover shot is by him, by Pat. So this book became a family affair too, which is another odd, that'll probably never happen again in my lifetime, but it was a delight. There are two dedications, or well, one of them is a dedication, preliminary things in this book. One is this statement by John Thompson: "A bicycle kind of life, light, flexible, self-powered, self-directed, and unarmored." And then the dedication to the book is, "For all those who cycle, for the love, for the hell of it, to pick up a loaf of bread, who ride when they might drive, for the wind that long riders heed, and the air that powers us all." The first poem is called Rear Derailleur. Ingenious the way that down-low gizmo nudges the chain onto a bigger ring, and click, you are suddenly able to power up the hill. Up at the heady front end of the bike, a single flick of finger made it happen. How much magic are you holding back in all those other fingertips of yours? My friend, good friend Patty Ferreira, who teaches English at Norwich University, read this book and sent me an email and said, "Let's be clear, these poems are not about cycling." And actually, I did a reading a week ago at the Community College of Vermont in Winooski, and a student there said something similar. I think in both cases it was meant as a compliment. I'm not entirely sure. So I'll let you decide whether to both things, whether they're about cycling or not, and whether that's a good thing or not. Wind. A couple of poems about wind, because wind and weather are sort of prime elements, factors in cycling. Tailwind. At my back, a broad, invisible hand. The pedals were almost on their own. Their fast, perfect circles trace a forward path of fast, perfect circles from here to fleeting here. I'm showered by twirling maple wings. Leaves flash bright undersides and strain against stems, just barely held back on bent branches. Long grasses bob and dip. A blackbird struggling the other way flaps hard in slow motion. I've been that bird. Up ahead on the lush, sloping ridge, the long white arms of turbines rotate from tall towers like gleaming, elegant prophets. I'm blessed today by this unseen power. So much riding on it. And another poem about wind. As I said, it's a big deal. It's a big deal, but it's also an example of how cycling connects us with our surroundings and the environment. You're intensely aware of it in a way that, say, driving in a car, you're not. Long ride in high wind. You put your head down and push, pull. You think perfect circles with your feet. Same pressure, down, up, around, again, again. You drop to the lowest position. Present as little of yourself as you can keep presenting for the longest while you can. You pedal with crybaby thighs, mile after mile, straight into it. You burn. You say out loud, and it's blown back into you, this is stupid, really stupid. And you pedal straight into the burn. You're not trying to beat it. You can never beat it. You look at the tall, bent over grass, and you know you can never beat it. You're making your way through. You're admiring the force, invisible, relentless against torso, and the will that powers your lungs, Zen masters that take in, transform, make use, blow back a bit of their own. Same will that made your sweet, aged, dying cat keep trying to get up when its back legs could no longer do it. You wear a look that some would call grimace. You have no time to explain. You are happy. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. The sprint and the meander. Today, only a sweat-soaked dash will do. Hour-long sprint to flush the day's toxins, try to outrun what can't be faced. Bless the endorphin rush. All those splendid trees and fields ignored. Maybe tomorrow, meander, connect, and flow with the scene. Right now, the head-down thrust, lung to leg to pedal, pumping to beat time. So there are lots of different kinds of rides, right? And sometimes it's great just to go hell for leather and sweat. And other times it's fun just to look around. Another one of the photos. There are two poems in the book called Saddle, but I won't read those. We'll read different kind of bicycle, stationary bikes. In the gym. Some of you probably do that too. Lined up in the cardio room like washers at the laundromat. Whole lot of sweaty pedaling to stay put. Mine has a screen with an avatar touring mountains in Italy. No scenes of November in Vermont, dreary basement of the Y. A jokester dreamed this up, or philosopher. Sisyphus meets Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. Takes a lot of spin to get this healthy. And here's one that maybe connects a little bit more with the interest you folks have in traffic. And I know very little about traffic, except that I try to survive it. There's a winter commuter.
Great pictures, by the way.
Thank you. I'll relay that to my nephew. He'll be very pleased. This one's called North-South Winooski Avenue. You know the intersection of Pearl Street where North Winooski becomes South Winooski? Have you done it on a bicycle? Great fun, isn't it? It's got to be one of the candidates for the most challenging intersection in Vermont for cyclists. But I'm sure there are a bunch of, I can think of a few more that would be candidates too, but that one's quite something. North-South Winooski Avenue. Downtown where north collides with south at Pearl Street, the reassuring bike lane vanishes. Instantly you're squished into traffic that crowds, ignores, or maybe even hates you. You've tried to follow the rules, but now there are none that don't thrust you inches from growling metal claiming the lane. Winooski means land of the wild onion in Abenaki. So here you are at the crazed crossroad of onion and pearl, masters of swirl and close quarters. Metaphor is a tricky friend full of mixed messages, but it calms you down when shit hits fan, rubber hits road, proof is in pudding, fact meets fancy, or, God help you, pedal hits metal. The light flashes green for go if you dare. Cars close in tight layers around you, small as a pearl at the core. If one turns into knife that slashes the onion skin, expect lots of tears. No time to think of that now.
That is a storied intersection. In my field work among Burlington cyclists, it's always one that comes up.
Keeps coming up.
And in fact, I have a vignette in my own book of a cyclist telling me a story about being accosted by a driver in that intersection.
It's even tough for drivers,
Yeah.
right? Because one of the issues is the street doesn't continue straight. It sort of jogs, and everybody is kind of shoved over. And poor cyclists at the edge of the road are really in jeopardy there. It's an interesting one.
People fix that.
So here's one that connects. It's called The Commute, and it's a little bit about cycling, and it's a little bit about doing a job every day. The commute, a chain stretched from bed to bread labor and back home, like crank to wheel and back to crank, thanks to pedal and push. Hard going at times, sometimes an easy spin. Lots of links along the way. Colleagues, meetings, projects, conflicts, politics. Mostly okay, with a little oil of tolerance or a laugh to smooth the ride. Still a chain though, slip or not. Still a chain. This one I tried to make look like a crankshaft with a chain going backwards. And that's one of the other things I was trying to do in this book. I was playing with poetic forms and shapes quite a bit and having a good time with that. How you doing?
Great.
Great. favorite photo in the book. Oh, that's not it. Part of the magic of riding a bike is how the heck the thing stays up. Right? and I'm by no means a physicist, good Lord. But I've done a little reading on this issue, and some of you actually may know a lot more about this than I do, but it turns out that it's no simple thing to explain how a bicycle stays up. And in fact, even the folks who studied, the physicists who studied this in detail, aren't quite sure at some level how it stays up. They know a lot of the reasons why it stays up: the gyroscopic effect of the wheel spin, the forward motion, what's called the trail effect, which is the difference between the axis of steering and the hub of the wheel. Those are all contributing factors, and there are other ones as well. I read one article that suggested there were 24 different forces in play. I gave up after about 3. but at some point they're saying, okay, all that is true and all of that contributes to a bicycle staying up, but there's still something that we don't quite get about how this works. Anyway, this is from my brother Pat. It's called The Bike Upright. From childhood, push and push until the roll takes over, up goes foot onto pedal, teetering stops, and the forward glide begins. The thrill of a lifetime for any kid. The science says it's not just forward motion makes it work, but the turning of the wheels. Something to do with gyroscopes. And not just gyro either. Another something. You could prove it in a lab. For us on the proving ground pavement, though, it's all about push and progress. It takes a chunk of life to learn, if ever, that forward is just the means. And whirling wheels plus some unknown are what we really need. But forward is a kick, no doubt about it. The breeze on our cheeks, the passing pines, the river winding alongside the road. None of it would happen without upright. And upright would not happen without freely spinning wings. Follow the earnest child. With luck and focus, learn a bit of balance, and to love the word of wheels we do not understand.
It's an interesting question. When you need to know why something is true and when it is enough to know that it is true.
Yeah, well, that's the line where faith comes into play, doesn't it? Or magic, or fate, depending on if you want to follow it back to ancient times. Words like fate come into play. Say that again. That was beautiful. The line when what?
When it's enough to know, when you have to know why something is true and when it's enough to know that it is true. And I was actually thinking of it in a much more prosaic, like research kind of way. When can we take something as a given and when do we need to study why it happens?
I'm interested in the magic side of it.
Fair enough.
Which is also, I didn't really talk about, but this is what poetry does. You know, it pushes language to that edge of communication where it almost disintegrates, where it can't really convey anymore what it wants to. Or if it does manage on that rare occasion to convey, you may not quite understand how it happens. And that's okay. You know, I mean, it's interesting as a researcher, you're probably intensely interested in why, right? Poets will often say, don't ask me why. I just want to know how it works. And that's a generalization. It's not true as well, but it's an interesting question. Here's a short one. Buddha's bike. Spin your wheels. Don't ask why. You don't need... Believe it or not.
It's a good thing we worked out the sequence ahead of time.
That's right. That's incredible. Buddha's bike. Spin your wheels, don't ask why. You don't need to get anywhere to keep from falling over. Oh dear. Here's another one that is sort of a different aspect of how bikes work, having to do with the powertrain, the center of the bike, right, where the crankshaft is, the pedals, and the bottom bracket. Connects to the chain, connects to the wheels, sends power back, wheels through, anyway. And this is another example of playing with the shape. I tried to make this look like a crankshaft, one part of it anyway. Powertrain, compact low center of it all, where thrust meets crankset, frame, and chain, powers hub, spoke, rim, and tire to cover ground. But it so depends on last night's sleep, too much wine at dinner, an argument over money, the kiss that sweetly made it up. It all goes back to the kiss. You know that now, so far and sweaty down the road. The kiss connects, the kiss drives all. Not that the steel down low is nothing, but it is nothing without the kiss. I like this one too. All right, I'm going to risk the title poem, Cycling in Plato's Cave. So I don't know if you know the allegory of Plato's Cave, some of you probably do. So it's an important story in Western culture. It's kind of a centerpiece of Plato's thought. And to oversimplify it horribly, he thought of the way humans view their lives and live their lives as being like people who are in a cave chained to the wall of the cave in such a way that they can only look straight ahead. And when they look straight ahead, what they see is the other side of the wall, the other side of the cave. They can't turn sideways to the mouth of the cave. And they're seeing things on the other wall, which are essentially shadows cast by light from outside the cave, going through items outside the cave and flashing shadows on the wall. They're seeing these shadows, and that's all they can see. So what happens, according to Plato, is people feel that's reality. That's all there is. That's all they know. And what Plato is suggesting is that the reality is what's outside the cave, and in fact is sort of an ideal form of things outside the cave flashing on the wall. I have lots of problems with Plato's thought, and I'd be a long conversation about the damage that it has done in our culture, I think. But one of the things that interests me about this is the talk about perspective. It's really about what you can see. And cycling raises those kinds of thoughts for me too. What is it that I'm seeing as I'm cycling along the road? What is it that I'm not seeing? What is it that I'm passing so quickly that I don't really take it in very well? What is it that, or what happens to what passes when it's back there? Is it still there? How do we perceive that? Anyway, that's what this poem's about. But I don't need to read the poem now, I just get ready to talk about it. I suppose it's dangerous. You can talk the poem away. Cycling in Plato's Cave. Those shumacs up ahead, so sexy with red droops. A dang blur up close as I whiz by, then gone. Stacked up behind somehow. Who knows what happens in the past? If I turn to look for longer than a blink, I'll end in a heap or hospital. Probably this is all about you, or rather me missing you. Sun over my shoulder, searing my nape. Wrap around dark glasses. So much brilliance I don't dare face. Even the cows and fence posts, so floodlit I squint as they glide into focus then out, then vanish. How much have I only glanced at and let pass? I'm helmeted, a goofy warrior braced for an old god's bolt. Still, the pedals spin. The faithful derailleur clicks the chain into another gear. The spokes twirl like roulette or a sundial on fast forward. The tires whir soft as a pigeon's coo. Wind cools exposed skin and sometimes stings the eyes to tears, as if sorrow rides the air and drops in from time to time. No idea what's back there. Small notion what's ahead. Plenty, no doubt, to treasure and fear. You or not you. Balance comes with motion. Road races away below. The yellow light flashes and is gone. Haven't done the time, right?
Yeah. We've been going for 25 minutes, 20 minutes, 23 minutes.
20 minutes. Hanging in. Should I keep going? All right. Do a few more. This is a tricycle, not a bicycle. But I like it. And for some reason, it works for me with this small poem about having a bicycle stolen. Anybody ever had a bike stolen? Terrible. It's called Negative Space. Your red 3-speeder, not there. Stolen out back where it leaned against brick. Not quite 9. For the first time, you know absence as a presence. Huge, untouchable presence. Another short one called Tandem. This one has an epigraph. I'll sing. But you'd look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two. We all know that, right? At the launch, the music attendant who sang the whole thing. It's fabulous. That's my favorite moment in the whole Tandem. Hardly ever 2 guys. Usually a man in front, woman behind, looking square between his shoulder blades or trying to crane around. Pedals does not steer. Sometimes 2 women, hardly ever 2 guys. The executive director of Locomotion, Emily Baker, wrote back to me and said, absolutely. On that one. But then another person told me that day he had seen 2 guys on a tandem. This photo is not in the book, and it's, many of these photos were taken at an incredible store in Ottawa called the Bike Dump. So this verges into the sort of social political aspects. Here's a quote. Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. The picture of free, untrammeled womanhood. Susan B. Anthony said that in the early part of the 20th century. And the 1890s and onward marked a tremendous, well, it was a bicycle craze, really, right? A huge interest in cycling, and a huge interest in cycling by women. And it even spawned changes in clothing because women started wearing pants, essentially, so that they could cycle. So there's this whole social political aspect of cycling, which I haven't gone into too much in this book, but it really is fascinating. And it's especially fascinating to me to think of the role that cycling has played in women's rights and the suffragette movement, getting the vote. So there is one poem here called Bike Politic. I'll just read 3 more, maybe, including this one. Bike Politic. Without doubt, good for the environment. At least we think so. Seems likely. At least it isn't bad. Good enough to go on. Good enough for a spin. As if it's not too late. Well, no matter what, environment will endure. Just maybe without us. If it could or cared to say, we might hear, and then the rest of this, most of this is a quote by the environment. It's in italics in the book, that's why I mentioned it. If it could or cared to say, we might hear, human, you took yourself for one wild ride. And now, a nasty teenage crash. Time's up. You had your spin. Sorry, you had your fun. Paid little heed. Look, no kid who'd grabbed dad's keys, roared off with his buddies, and ran into a pole ever gave a thought to what comes next. Until next took over the wheel and rammed the future home. Time now to die off. Let some other creature have its day. Flower beetles are a good bet. Or something simple, single-celled, that takes a long, slow time to learn what works. I'll miss you, though. Such lunacy. The pedals turn, the wheels turn. No word from headquarters. On with the ride. It's not exactly the happiest poems. And I meant to read another one from another book, and I think I forgot to bring it. Yeah. But I will mention, if you're interested in poetry having to do with the environment, a wonderful book called So Little Time, Words and Images for a World in Climate Crisis. It's an anthology with many Vermont writers in it, including me and many writers from around the world and photographers, a couple of Nobel Prize winners. It's put out by Green Writers Press of Brattleboro. It's a beautiful book. I'm really sorry I forgot it. I was going to read one piece of it. Anyway, 2 more pieces. Back to the cover. This one's called Inscape. I know what you're thinking with all this cycle babble. A bike ride is just a bike ride. I mean, really. Rubbish. A bike ride is never just a bike ride. And I have no notion what you're thinking. Really. I barely know what rolls around my own psychodrome, let alone yours, except it's probably a long winding tour with twists of terrain to terrify, delight, sadden, bore the tights off you sometimes. A burst of rain, a shaft of sun, a shimmering field, a rabbit, deer leaping to unheard godly music. Or the worry du jour, round and round in your Vex box, every bleak corner poked and repoked. You grind on, breathe. Sometimes an old bad song is a constant worm in your skull. Funny at first, then creepy, then miles of, please God, make it stop. After a while, a river you love curls near and gracefully away. That kind of ride. Am I right or am I right? And I'll read one more and then stop. Cycle, short one. The way a wheel turns, grounded low, spinning free up top. A life like that, you might get somewhere. That's it. So there are more, but that gives you the flavor of it. Oh, by the way, I did bring a few if you're interested. You know, we mentioned Phoenix before, but I have them for less money. Sorry, Glenn.
Oh wow.
Anyway.
Well, we have just a little over 10 minutes. Comments, questions? I have a question of my own, which is, you know, the way you present cycling is that it's this play between present-mindedness and like being there in the act, but then connecting it to these bigger pasts and futures. And so it has me wondering, what are you thinking about when you're on a bicycle? I mean, what is your process of writing poetry like, and how does the bicycle itself enable or inhibit that process?
It's a great question, and I'm half inclined to, I don't know your name, sorry.
John.
John, I'm half inclined to hide behind John's comment and say I have no idea. And I'm not interested in knowing what, but I am interested. I mull that a lot. One of the things that well, I'll talk first about riding a bike. There's something about the motion and the spinning of the wheels, even although when you're on a bike, and especially if you're going at a good clip, you're not obviously looking at the wheels, but you're aware of them turning. And there's something about that that encourages a kind of free association, meditation. Have you experienced this? I imagine you have. I mean, it's even part of the language. You know, we talk about, we look at somebody who appears to be thinking hard about something and we say, oh, see the wheels turn. Right? There's something about that motion that encourages, and it's not, also the shape of the wheel is not linear. It's circular. Although it's a closed shape, still there's something about it that encourages free association. And a similar thing happens with a poem when it's working. Poems, talk to 100 poets and you're going to get 100 different answers about how poems emerge. Actually, you're going to get thousands of different answers because each poet's going to say, well, it happens for me in many different ways. But one of the ways it happens is that you have a kernel of something, an image, a snippet of conversation that's evocative in some way, something you're looking at, and you start musing on that, and if you're lucky, it starts to gather the thinking starts to gather some momentum, much like a bicycle. A lot of the times, even most of the time, momentum doesn't happen. And it goes nowhere. But once in a while, it goes. And then the poem generates from that. And then there's endless rewriting, of course, which is, I guess, maybe that's sort of parallel to fixing the bike when it breaks down. I don't know. But there is a similarity, a little bit of a similarity between the poetic process and the cycling thing. But I'm not sure if that addresses your question, Louise, but it's the thing about the free association that seems to be encouraged. The other thing is, well, a couple of different things. Mentioned earlier that cycling puts you in touch with your immediate environment in a way that lots of other kinds of travel don't. Walking works the same way. But then, for me, the speed of cycling also is a factor that encourages thought. But so there's some immediate sensory experience there that comes from riding a bike, that puts you in touch with your surroundings that isn't necessarily available in other forms of travel. That encourages a kind of thinking that is akin to what happens when a poem is generated. was another thing I wanted to say there. Gone. Maybe it'll come back. Does that address the issue as well? At all? Anybody else have thoughts about that? Or other thoughts?
I might be the only person in here who doesn't really like cycling. I mean, I do it because it gets me from point A to point B.
Yeah.
But I like walking. I like walking so much better just in terms of that thinkingness when I'm on a bike. All the sore butts and whatnot is.
My wife is the same way. You know, she loves walking, and what she doesn't like about biking, well, there's the traffic, of course, but all the rigmarole with the mechanics don't interest her, and in fact distract her from this kind of deep thinking. But for me, it's the other way around. It encourages. So yeah, there are certainly different responses. You know.
Do you use a helmet when you cycle?
I do. In fact, it's kind of funny. Everyone's, you know, due to my hairstyle, when I go out of the house, and I'll sometimes forget the helmet, right? And I'll be 50 feet down the road, and I feel the wind on my head. And wait, something doesn't feel right. Oh my God! I forgot my helmet. No, I do. I very much believe in helmets. I know some people who have been badly injured because they didn't have helmets, and I know of 2 people who died personally. So, who wouldn't have, I think. Anyway, no, I'm all for helmets. I'm all for social planning that encourages better cycling, pedestrian infrastructure. It comes down to that. So, you know, cycling is an easy sell for most people. They like to bike, and it also reminds them of childhood and the freedom and blah, 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 blah. Except that people are often afraid of the traffic, with good reason. And so whether cycling can become more, I'm really ranging here into realms that you folks know much more about than I do, whether it can become more than something that a few people can take advantage of really depends upon developing infrastructure, I think. Some of you may have been involved with the recent debate in Burlington to pass a plan to add bike lanes to the North Avenue corridor, et cetera. And there was a lot going on at Front Porch Forum, people going back and forth. And sometimes the conversation was pitting cyclists against drivers, and that's unfortunate because I don't think that's really what that was about. And one comment stuck with me to illustrate it. One fellow said, "Well, I'm both a driver and a cyclist," and he said, "When I'm driving, I get really pissed off at cyclists, and when I'm a cyclist, I get really pissed off at drivers." And I thought, okay, this is a reasonable human being with a very interesting point of view. That says to me, the infrastructure is the problem, right? Not the person there. So anyway, I think that's free associating here. But I think that is the future. I hope it's the future from a public policy perspective.
Going back to your Winooski poem, which talked about trying to follow all the rules, for me, I think that's one of the big keys in the vehicle traffic, bicycle traffic interaction is the more predictable it is, the happier everyone is, and the more people are trying to guess what people are doing, or they have to do something out of the ordinary because a bike lane disappears in the middle of a road.
Yeah.
That's when we start getting people pissed off at each other.
I think you're right.
Well, and there's a certain Americanization of bicycling that isn't necessarily shared in the rest of the world in terms of it's what I see as more of its informality, and part of that is built infrastructure. So Europe doesn't have, particularly in urban areas, a lot of space in that, and so bikes and pedestrians present really slow cars down or exclude them. and lend themselves more, or in other countries, lesser developed countries, where bikes are much more common because people can't afford cars. So it's less. Here, we're gear obsessed, we're clothing obsessed, style obsessed, costs, when people are buying $5,000 bikes. So, how you see that, or if you kind of experienced it differently biking, even maybe in Canada than in the US.
I don't know if it's much different in Canada from the US, but I don't have a lot of firsthand experience, but my impression about North America compared with Europe agrees entirely with you. And it's not just in the area of cycling, it's in the area, Europeans have had to get along in much closer quarters than North Americans, and they've found ways to do that. Cycling, housing, the notion of huge single-family houses that we have here is very puzzling to most Europeans, I think, who live in apartments, often small apartments, their whole lives. I think that's absolutely fine. So there is a North America, right? You need to think more about that, the difference between North America and Europe in that regard.
I think if I could say something about some of these differences, I think some of it, we live in different sensory worlds, and I think one of the values that I see in the poems you're writing is you're probing the sensory world of the cyclist. And when we talk about bicycle politics or making bicycles more sort of common forms of transportation, cyclists immediately come to a sensory kind of language. We talk about the importance of the wind in our hair, and the freedom, that sense of freedom. And I think part of the struggle for me is engaging in public policy debate over our sensory experience, because car driving can cut you off sensorially, or sensorially it surrounds you with sound like the radio, but it cuts you off from that environment, and we embrace that sort of openness and engagement with the environment itself. So how do you build a politics on sensory arguments? It's one of the things I'm always thinking about. Right?
That's a great point. And especially when not only is there a car culture that does not have that kind of sensory experience, but actually likes it. I mean, people like to be isolated. Some people who like that isolation. So where do you go with that in terms of policy? But so how to talk about it? So we're this is oversimplification, but we're talking about seeing cycling as a kind of meditative thing that has easier connections than most of our experience to the world around us, to sensory experience. And we're also talking about the nuts and bolts of bicycles and traffic and navigating and getting along with each other, etc. And I think there have to be ways that can connect these two. One of the things is that if you're somebody who is interested in cycling from that meditative, experiential way, and you get into cycling that way, my experience is it doesn't take long before people start to think, okay, yeah, what about cycling as a very practical means of getting around? And what about the social issues involved there? And you start thinking about commuting, for example, and getting rid of your car, or the limiting use of your car, blah, 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 blah. If you get into it from the other end, as a very practical means of getting around, I think, you might have at least two people here who are going to disagree with me, I think it's pretty easy to move from that kind of perspective to the other side, to say, okay, I got into this as a way of getting from A to B, home to work, to grocery shopping. But there's something different about this way of getting around from what I experience in cars, the wind, etc. And so there are pretty natural connections between these two things. If people can simply pay attention to what they are feeling. Paying attention is not something that we're good at in this culture. And we're a lot worse at it than we used to be. Yeah, that might not be true, but we're not good at it. Anyway, I'm risking being on a soapbox, but those connections are what I'm interested in.
Well, it's 1 o'clock. Humanities hour is over. So you get back to work. No, I'm just kidding. We appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah.
Great. And David has copies if you're interested in the book, or if you want to see. I have a signed copy here, and I have a look at the poems.
So it's great. Thank you.